My family is a little quirky, I'll admit. Every year we have this odd tradition. While most families spend their winter vacations skiing or roasting marshmallows by the fire, my family, we like to play laser tag. In the woods, at night, in the dead of winter. Vermont was our usual spot, and the tall pines and thick undergrowth provided the perfect setting for what my dad called extreme laser tag. You see, for them, it's not just a game, it's a test of survival instincts. It's always been a strange bonding activity, but as weird as it sounds, I was excited this year. It would be my first time joining in. Growing up, I'd always been too young to play, so I watched from the sidelines, listening to my parents' laughs echo through the dark woods. But this year, I was old enough. I had my gear, I had my laser gun, and I was ready to go. The rules were simple. Go out one by one, and the last person standing wins. You can shoot anyone in your way, but the key is to not get hit yourself. I was feeling confident, maybe even cocky. But you know what they say, pride comes before the fall. That night, the forest was pitch black, the sky overcast, smothering any moonlight. A thick blanket of snow covered the ground, crunching beneath every step. The wind was howling through the branches, sending flurries of snowflakes swirling in the air. But it wasn't just the cold biting at me. There was this heaviness, like the forest itself was pressing in on me. Still, I thought it was just nerves. My breath came out in little clouds, and I could feel the adrenaline already pumping through my veins. I went into the woods first, ahead of everyone else. They'd come after me, my family, but I'd have time to hide, time to strategize. As I moved deeper into the forest, my boots sinking into the snow, the trees started to close in. Everything looked the same. Dark trunks, skeletal branches coated in frost. My footsteps were muffled by the snow, but every so often the wind would whip up, creating an eerie wail that made me shiver. I shook it off. It was just the wind, just the wind. After about 15 minutes, I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone either. Usually by now, I'd at least catch a glimpse of a red or green laser flash in the distance. The game was always competitive, but it wasn't supposed to be this quiet. I started to think maybe they were ganging up on me, letting me get deep into the woods before ambushing me. That's when I heard it, the crunch. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the forest, it was unmistakable. A footstep. And it wasn't mine. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I was trained for this, though. Stay calm, assess the situation, that's what my dad always said. So I crouched down, using a thick tree as cover, and waited, listening. For a few seconds, nothing. Just the wind, the trees creaking, and the occasional distant sound of snow sliding off branches. I started to relax. Maybe it was a deer or the snow settling. But then the crunch came again. Closer this time. Deliberate. Someone was moving in my direction. I swung my laser gun around ready to fire, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but I told myself to calm down. It was probably one of my family members trying to sneak up on me. I'd catch them first. I'd win this game. I moved carefully, making my way toward where I'd heard the sound. The snow made it impossible to be completely silent, but I did my best, pausing every few steps to listen. I kept my eyes sharp, scanning for any movement, any flash of light. I rounded a corner between two trees and stopped cold. There, on the ground, were footprints, fresh ones, leading off into the deeper part of the forest. But these weren't from one of my family members. They were too big. The stride was too long, and they were too deep, like whoever made them was heavier. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, there was a snap, a branch breaking somewhere close by. Too close. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and that's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the thick trees. But then he moved, stepping into a patch of pale moonlight. He was tall, too tall to be my dad or anyone else in my family. He was wearing a dark coat, and in his hand, I swear my heart stopped for a second. In his hand, he was holding a knife. I panicked. Without thinking, I bolted. I wasn't even sure where I was running, but my body had taken over. The snow was deep, making it hard to move quickly, but adrenaline kicked in, pushing me forward. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him. His footsteps, much heavier than mine, crashing through the underbrush. I stumbled over roots, slipped on icy patches, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs were screaming, but fear kept me going. My only thought was to get away, to find my family, to warn them. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. There was a figure standing there, but this time it wasn't him. It was someone else. Lucian. Lucian was a friend of the family, and he wasn't supposed to be here. He'd joked about joining the game earlier, but I thought he'd stayed back at the cabin. Seeing him now was like a lifeline. He looked at me, confused at first, but then he saw the fear in my eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping toward me. I tried to speak, but I couldn't get the words out fast enough. My breaths were ragged, coming in sharp gasps. I pointed behind me, toward the trees, and that's when he saw him, the man with the knife. Lucian didn't hesitate. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me behind him. He was calm, way too calm for what was happening. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to face the guy down, keeping me safe while backing us away slowly. The man didn't follow. He just stood there watching us with these cold, dark eyes. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and melted back into the trees. I was shaking all over. My legs felt like jelly, and I collapsed to the ground. Lucian crouched next to me, telling me to breathe, that it was over, but I wasn't so sure. We made our way back to the cabin as fast as we could, not stopping to look back. When we finally got there, I practically fell through the door. My family was there, laughing, oblivious to what had just happened. I told them everything, about the man, about the knife. They thought I was joking at first, part of some elaborate prank. But then, we called the police. They searched the woods, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of the man, no traces of the footprints, nothing. But when they got to the edge of the forest, where the trees started to thin out near the road, they found something. A laser gun, one of ours, lying next to a snowman, its arms twisted into an eerie, almost human shape. And that's when it hit me. That man, he wasn't playing the game. He never was. You know, there are some things that just don't fade away, no matter how much time passes. Most of the memories I have from high school are hazy, faded Polaroids of stupid pranks, awkward dates, and late-night cramming sessions. But there's one memory, one summer trip, that stays with me like a scar. I never really talked much about it, partly because it sounds insane, and partly because a part of me still doesn't want to believe it happened. But here goes. It was the summer after our junior year, and I was 17. Greg's dad owned this summer house up in Maine, right on the edge of one of those huge, dark lakes. It was the kind of place that felt like it had 1,000 stories buried under its floorboards, old, weathered, with that faint smell of wood and lake water. The house wasn't big, but it was perfect for a bunch of teenagers looking for a taste of freedom. It was just me, Greg, Jay, and Mark, 4 friends who'd known each other since we were kids. We arrived on a Thursday evening, the sun dipping low over the trees, painting everything in warm orange and gold. I remember the wind rustling through the pine needles, the air so crisp you could almost feel it on your skin. The house itself sat at the edge of the lake, its silhouette reflected in the dark water. There was something about it that felt heavy. It's hard to explain, but even then, as we unloaded our bags from Greg's dad's truck, I felt this weird twinge in my chest, like the place was watching us. The first night was normal enough. We made burgers on the grill, joked around, and even went for a swim. The water was freezing, but we laughed it off, daring each other to stay in the longest. Mark, of course, won. He always had a competitive streak, a need to push himself further than the rest of us. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel. I woke up early, the kind of early where the sky's still gray and the air feels heavy with dew. I remember stumbling out of my room, my head still fuzzy with sleep, and noticing that something was missing. My Barcelona soccer cap. I loved that cap. It was a gift from my uncle, who'd brought it back from Spain, and I always kept it in the same spot, right on top of my bag. I searched everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, even behind the dresser. Nothing. I figured maybe one of the guys was messing with me, so I went into the kitchen, half expecting to find it perched on Greg's head or something. But they all just shrugged, said they hadn't seen it. Greg even made some crack about how I was losing my mind already, and we all laughed. But the thing is, it didn't feel like a joke. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, but later that day, I noticed something else. My pen, this stupid blue pen I'd had for years, with a little dent where I'd bitten it during tests, was missing too. Again, it was small, insignificant even, but it made my stomach tighten in this weird, anxious way. It wasn't like I was losing things left and right. I knew where I put my stuff, and it was just gone. That night, we stayed up late, playing cards around the old coffee table in the living room. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace, the dim light flickering across our faces. Mark was in an especially weird mood, quieter than usual, his eyes darting around like he was trying to keep track of something we couldn't see. Every time I looked at him, he had this distant expression, like he wasn't really there with us. When we finally went to bed, I was exhausted, my mind heavy. I fell asleep fast, but it didn't last. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was one of those awakenings where you don't know why you're awake, but something feels wrong. The room was dark, the air cold, and I could hear the wind outside, making the house groan softly. And then I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I held my breath, listening, straining my ears against the silence. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely there. It was coming from Mark's room, which was right across the hallway. It sounded like someone whispering to him, or maybe it was Mark whispering to himself. Either way, it made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was this soft, rhythmic mumbling, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. I wanted to get up, to go check on him, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body tense, my mind racing with every horrible possibility. Who was in his room? Was someone in the house? My heart pounded, and I lay there for what felt like hours, just listening to those whispers, too terrified to do anything. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. The whispers felt like a bad dream, something that only existed in the dark. But when I looked at Mark, sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes had these dark circles under them, his face pale. He barely spoke, just stared down at his plate, pushing the food around without eating. I couldn't shake the feeling, that sense that something was seriously wrong. It was like there was a shadow over us, something heavy and dark that no one wanted to acknowledge. I decided to look for my missing things again, hoping maybe they just turned up somewhere. I went through my bag, through the room, even outside by the fire pit. Nothing. And then I had this thought. What if Mark had taken them? I know it sounds crazy, but something about the way he'd been acting made me suspicious. He was always kind of a joker, but this was different. It wasn't funny, it was unsettling. When no one was looking, I made my way to Mark's room, my heart pounding in my chest. I just wanted to take a quick look to see if maybe my stuff had ended up there by accident. His room was a mess, clothes thrown everywhere, his bag half open on the floor. I knelt down beside it, my hands shaking as I started to sift through it. And that's when I found it. Not just my cap, but my pen too, shoved down at the bottom beneath his clothes. My heart sank, this cold wave of fear washing over me. I wanted to believe it was some kind of joke, but it didn't feel like a joke. And then I saw the notebook. It was small, black, the kind with an elastic band around it. I hadn't seen Mark with it before, and something about it made my stomach twist. I opened it, flipping through the pages, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The pages were filled with drawings, horrible, twisted images of people. There were stick figures, their faces contorted in pain, some with their limbs twisted at impossible angles, others with dark scribbles over their eyes. And then, near the middle, I found something that made my breath catch. It was a drawing of a person, a stick figure, but it had something familiar, a cap, my cap, and it was nailed to a cross, lines of red ink dripping down from its arms. I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe. I backed out of the room, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Why would Mark do this? What did it mean? I knew I had to tell someone. I found Greg's dad out on the dock, fishing in the early afternoon sun. He looked at me with a frown as I approached, my face probably as white as a sheet. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words, telling him about the missing things, the whispers, the drawings. He didn't believe me, at least not at first. He looked at me like I was just another kid making up stories. But I insisted. I told him about the notebook, and finally he followed me back inside. When he saw it, saw the drawings, saw my cap and pen in Mark's bag, his expression changed. He didn't say anything, just grabbed the notebook and told me to pack my things. We were leaving. It all happened in a blur after that. Greg's dad got us all out of the house, none of us really understanding what was happening. Mark didn't say anything, just stared at the ground, his face blank, his eyes empty. We left that afternoon, driving away from the house, the lake growing smaller in the rearview mirror until it was gone. When I got home, I told my parents everything. They called the police, but by the time anyone got back to that house, Mark was gone. His parents never heard from him again, and we all just tried to move on, to pretend it had never happened. But it did happen. I know it did. Because a few years later, when I was in college, I got a letter. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. Inside was my pen. I still remember that night vividly, even though it feels like something out of a nightmare. The clock on the dashboard said 2:08 a.m., and I was somewhere on the loneliest stretch of highway I'd ever driven. The only sound was the low hum of my old Ford pickup, and the steady hiss of tires rolling over asphalt. The night sky was moonless, just an endless void above, and the highway stretched out before me, dark and desolate. I wasn't supposed to be driving this late. I had a long day at work, but my friend needed a hand with something in another town, and well, it's what friends do. The drive home had been uneventful, just mile after mile of empty road, when suddenly, in the distance, I noticed the flash of hazard lights. It was a car pulled off on the shoulder, a blue Bronco, and even from a distance, I could see the hood was popped open. Normally I would have just driven by, but there was something about it, something that made me slow down. Maybe it was the late hour or the fact that the road was completely deserted. I figured, what the hell, maybe they need help. As I got closer, I could make out a figure standing next to the Bronco, waving. It was a woman. She looked about my age, mid-30s, with long dark hair, wearing a heavy coat, and beside her was a dog, a large one, its shape just barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. I pulled over in front of her Bronco, turning on my hazard lights as well. I stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin, and walked over to her. She looked relieved when she saw me coming, and the dog barked once, just a low woof, as if to say, "Who are you?" "Hey there, need some help?" I asked, trying to sound friendly but cautious. The woman smiled, though her eyes looked tired, almost haunted. "Yeah, thank God you stopped. I'm Lydia. The engine just died on me, and I can't get it to start. I don't know much about cars, and I've been here for over an hour," she said, her voice trembling a bit. "I'm Ford," I said, giving her a nod. "Let me take a look." I moved over to the front of the Bronco and peered under the hood. I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine well enough to spot an obvious problem. I fiddled around for a bit, but it was too dark to see much, even with my phone flashlight. "Yeah, this might need a tow," I said after a few minutes. "I don't think I can fix it here." Lydia sighed heavily, wrapping her arms around herself, looking up and down the highway. It was still empty, just an endless black ribbon stretching out into the darkness. "I was afraid you'd say that," she muttered. "Do you think maybe I could get a ride to the next town? It's not far, maybe 20 miles. I glanced at her, then at the dog, Max, she said his name was. He was a big German shepherd, sitting obediently by her feet, his ears perked up. The thought crossed my mind to just say no, to get back in my truck and leave. But something about the way she looked, standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in foggy puffs, it made me feel like I couldn't just leave her. "Yeah, all right," I said, nodding toward my truck. "Come on, it's not much, but it's warm." Lydia smiled, genuinely this time. Thank you, really. I don't know what I would have done. She whistled softly, and Max followed her to my truck. I opened the back door, and Max jumped in without hesitation. Lydia climbed in the passenger seat, and I got back behind the wheel. We pulled away from the Bronco, its hazard lights flashing in the darkness until they disappeared in my rearview mirror. The silence in the truck was heavy, broken only by the sound of the engine and the occasional creak of the old truck as we rolled over bumps in the road. After a few minutes, I tried to break the silence. "So, what were you doing out here so late?" I asked, glancing over at her. Lydia looked out the window, her face barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "I was visiting a friend," she said, her voice distant. "Lost track of time, I guess." I nodded, not pressing any further. Something about her answer felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I focused on the road ahead, the endless stretch of black, and that's when I saw him. A figure, standing by the side of the road, just standing there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. My headlights swept over him for just a moment. A tall man, dressed in dark clothes, his face shadowed, and then he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness as we passed. I felt a chill run down my spine, my hands tightening on the wheel. Lydia must have seen him too, because she shifted in her seat, her body tensing. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," I said, glancing at her. "Probably just some hitchhiker." Lydia didn't say anything, but I could feel her unease. The silence settled back in, thicker now, the air in the truck feeling colder. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the road, but something about that figure bothered me. The way he was just standing there, not moving, not even looking for a ride, just watching. A few more miles passed, the darkness pressing in on us, when suddenly I saw it. Headlights in the rearview mirror. At first I thought it was just another car, but as the lights got closer, I realized it was the Bronco. My heart skipped a beat. "That's impossible," I muttered, more to myself than to Lydia. "What?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "The Bronco, it's behind us." Lydia turned, looking out the back window. Her eyes went wide, her face paling. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It was dead. You saw it." I didn't know what to say. I just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the headlights behind us. They were getting closer, and I could feel my pulse quicken, a sense of dread settling in my stomach. The Bronco stayed with us, its headlights bright, almost blinding in the mirror. I pressed down on the gas, the old truck groaning as it picked up speed. Lydia was breathing faster now, her hands clenched in her lap, and Max let out a low growl from the back seat. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my voice tight, "but we're not stopping to find out." The highway stretched on, the Bronco tailing us, its lights never wavering. I could feel the tension in the truck, the fear that hung in the air like a thick fog. And then suddenly, the Bronco swerved, its tires screeching as it veered off the road. I glanced in the mirror just in time to see it roll, the headlights spinning wildly before everything went dark. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop, my heart pounding in my ears. "We have to help them," Lydia said, her voice shaky. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to keep going, to get as far away as possible. But I couldn't just leave, not after seeing that. I put the truck in reverse, backing up until we were near where the Bronco had gone off the road. It was lying on its side, the metal twisted, the windshield shattered. There was no movement, no sound, just the creak of the metal cooling in the night air. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Lydia and I got out of the truck, standing by the side of the road as I spoke to the dispatcher. The wind was colder now, biting through my jacket, and I could feel my breath fogging in the air. Lydia was staring at the Bronco, her eyes wide, her body tense. "They'll send someone," I said, hanging up. "We should wait here." Lydia nodded, but she didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on something in the darkness, her face pale. I followed her gaze and my heart skipped a beat. There, standing just beyond the wreckage, was the figure, the same one we'd seen by the side of the road. He was just standing there watching us, his face hidden in shadow. "Ford," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's here." I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me, my body tensing. "Get back in the truck," I said, my voice low, trying to stay calm. Lydia didn't move, her eyes locked on the figure. Max barked, a sharp, anxious sound, and that seemed to snap her out of it. She turned, running back to the truck, and I followed, my eyes never leaving the figure. We climbed in, slamming the doors shut, and I locked them, my hands shaking. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching, as if he knew we couldn't leave. "What does he want?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the figure standing by the wrecked Bronco. He was still, unnaturally still, like a statue carved out of shadow. My hands were slick with sweat, slipping on the steering wheel as I gripped it tight. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw him closer. I put the truck in gear, my foot pressing down on the gas. The engine roared to life, and we lurched forward, back onto the road. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, his form fading into the darkness as we sped away, the wreckage of the Bronco vanishing behind us. I kept my eyes on the road, my heart pounding, my hands still trembling. The night felt heavier now, the darkness deeper, like something was pressing in on us, following us. The silence in the truck was thick, Lydia's breathing coming in short, uneven bursts. Max, usually calm, was restless, shifting in the back seat, his ears perked, as if he was still listening for something. "Ford," Lydia finally said, her voice barely audible. "Who was that?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice tight. I wanted to sound calm, in control, but the truth was I was scared, more scared than I had been in a long time. "But he's gone now. We're okay." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was like a pressure at the back of my mind, a weight that I couldn't shake. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the road stretching out endlessly before us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, or that figure standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing, just darkness. Lydia hadn't said anything more, but she was clutching Max, her hands buried in his fur. I could see her reflection in the side window, her face pale, her eyes wide, staring at the night beyond the glass as if expecting something to appear. Suddenly Max began to growl, a low, rumbling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Lydia stiffened, her eyes widening as she looked out the window. "Ford," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's something out there." I glanced to the side, my eyes scanning the darkness. At first I didn't see anything, but then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse, something moving between the trees, keeping pace with us. It was fast, impossibly fast, and it was getting closer. "Hang on," I said, my voice barely steady as I pressed down on the gas. The truck roared, the engine groaning as we picked up speed, the needle on the speedometer climbing. The road was a blur beneath us, the dark trees whipping past, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. Max's growl grew louder, his hackles raised, and Lydia was staring out the window, her face a mask of fear. Whatever was out there, it was still with us, moving just beyond the edge of the headlights, always just out of sight. The road twisted, and I took the turn too fast, the tires skidding for a moment before finding traction. I could feel the truck struggling, the old suspension groaning under the strain, but I couldn't slow down. Not now. "Ford, please," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking. She was terrified, and I couldn't blame her. I was too. The road ahead was dark, empty, and I kept my eyes focused forward, refusing to look into the mirrors, refusing to acknowledge the movement I could see out of the corner of my eye. I just kept driving, faster and faster, the truck shaking as we barreled down the deserted highway. Then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped into the middle of the road. I barely had time to react. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching, the truck skidding sideways. Lydia screamed, and Max barked, the sound echoing in the cab as we slid to a stop, the headlights illuminating the figure. It was him, the same figure we'd seen by the Bronco, the same one that had been watching us. He was standing in the middle of the road, his face still hidden in shadow, his body perfectly still. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what to do. Run him over? Back up? I couldn't think, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to get away. Ford. Lydia's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He's coming. I looked up and my blood ran cold. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, walking toward us, his face still hidden in shadow. There was something about the way he moved. Something wrong. It was too smooth, too fluid, like he wasn't walking at all, just gliding over the asphalt. "Hold on," I said, my voice barely steady. I threw the truck into reverse, my foot slamming down on the gas. The truck lurched backward, the engine roaring as we sped away, the figure growing smaller in the distance. But he didn't stop. He just kept coming, his movements slow, steady, relentless. I swung the truck around, the tires skidding on the asphalt, and floored it. The engine roared, the truck shaking as we sped down the highway, the figure vanishing in the rearview mirror. We drove in silence, the only sound the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart. I didn't know where we were going, didn't care, as long as it was away from there. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance. Small, flickering lights that grew closer, brighter, until I realized it was a gas station. I pulled in, the tires skidding on the gravel, and stopped, my hands still trembling as I put the truck in park. Lydia was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her eyes wide. Max was still growling, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We're okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We're okay." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if it was true. The feeling of being watched was still there, that weight pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing in the road, his face hidden in shadow. I got out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin. The gas station was empty, the lights flickering, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked inside, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The place was deserted, the shelves half empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I walked up to the counter, but there was no one there. I rang the bell, the sound echoing through the empty store. Nothing, no one. I turned, looking out the window, and my heart skipped a beat. There in the distance, just beyond the edge of the light, I could see him, the figure, just standing there, watching. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps, my heart pounding. I ran out of the store, back to the truck, my hands shaking as I pulled the door open. "We need to go," I said, my voice breaking. Lydia looked at me, her eyes wide, and nodded. Max barked, a sharp, anxious sound, and I put the truck in gear, the tires spinning on the gravel as we pulled away. The figure watched us, his form growing smaller, fading into the darkness as we drove away. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart pounding. We drove until the sun began to rise, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, and finally, the feeling of being watched began to fade. The tension in the truck eased, and Lydia let out a shaky breath, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. But even as the sun rose, even as the darkness lifted, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not yet. I still remember that day vividly. It started like any ordinary Saturday. I had just turned 18 a few weeks earlier and was excited to meet my boyfriend after not seeing him for nearly a month. We had this date planned out, a picnic by the lake that we loved. I even remember the way my heart was racing, not from fear, but from excitement. Little did I know I would experience fear like never before. The day was overcast, but not yet raining. One of those gray, moody days that makes everything seem quieter, softer. I waited at the bus stop, scrolling through my phone, barely paying attention to anything around me. There were a few people standing nearby, but I didn't really notice them. I was too busy imagining how my day would unfold. When the bus arrived, the doors opened with that familiar hiss, and I climbed aboard, dropping some loose change into the machine before finding an empty seat. The bus was about half full, and I chose a window seat near the back. resting my head against the cold glass as the world slowly moved by outside. As the bus made its way through town, stopping every now and then to pick up passengers, I noticed two men get on. They looked rough, disheveled. You know, the type of people that seem like they've been through a lot, maybe too much. I didn't think too much of them at first, just figured they were passing through like everyone else. They sat a couple of seats in front of me, talking loudly, their voices carrying over the hum of the engine and the chatter of the other passengers. Something about them made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just how they looked, worn clothes, ragged beards. It was the way they spoke, their eyes darting around, lingering too long on people, especially the women. I tried to ignore it, but a strange feeling settled into the pit of my stomach. They must have noticed me glancing in their direction, because after a while, one of them turned around, catching my eye. He smiled, a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and nudged his friend, whispering something. The second man looked back too, and suddenly I could feel their eyes on me, sizing me up. I quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on my phone, but it didn't make the feeling go away. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I was just on my way to meet my boyfriend, and these were just a couple of guys on a bus. Nothing more. But even as I thought that, I could hear their whispers, their laughter. Every time I looked up, one of them was looking back at me, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. The bus ride felt like it lasted forever. I could hear their conversation turning, becoming more pointed, like they were talking about me. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, but it wasn't much of a distraction. The cityscape passing by was dull, blurred by the overcast sky. Then one of them stood up. He walked slowly down the aisle, coming to a stop beside my seat. He leaned over, his hand resting on the back of the empty seat in front of me, and smiled. The smile was oily, forced. "Hey there," he said, his voice low. "You look like you're going somewhere fun." I tried to be polite, offering a tight-lipped smile without really looking at him. "Just meeting a friend," I said, hoping that would be enough to make him leave. But it wasn't. He lingered there, too close, the smell of his breath mixing with the faint odor of sweat. "Meeting a friend, huh?" He chuckled, and I could hear his friend laughing from a few rows up. "How about you come sit with us? We could use some company." "No, thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. I felt my pulse quicken, a tightness in my chest. I wished someone would notice, step in, say something. But the other passengers seemed absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to what was happening. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer, and I felt his fingers brush against my arm. It was such a small touch, barely anything at all, but it sent a shock through me, my whole body tensing. I turned my head, my eyes locking onto his. "Please, leave me alone." He held my gaze for a moment, and then with a smirk he backed off, sauntering back to his seat. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on my phone again, anything to distract myself. But I could still hear them, the whispers, the laughter. They were talking about me, making comments, and I knew they weren't done yet. The bus came to a stop, and more passengers got off, leaving the bus emptier, quieter. I considered getting off too, just to get away from them, but I didn't want to be stranded somewhere unfamiliar. So I stayed, watching as the world outside grew dimmer, the sky turning a darker shade of gray. A few stops later, the bus pulled into a rest area, a small, dingy place with a couple of benches and a convenience store. The driver announced a short break, and people began to shuffle off the bus, stretching their legs. I hesitated, but decided to get off too. I needed some fresh air, something to calm my nerves. As I stepped off the bus, I felt a chill run through me. The air was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and the wind was picking up, rustling the trees that lined the edge of the parking lot. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, glancing around. The two men had gotten off as well, and they were standing by the door, watching me. I tried to ignore them, walking over to one of the benches and sitting down. I took out my phone, pretending to be engrossed in it, but I could feel their eyes on me. After a moment, one of them started walking toward me, and my heart began to pound. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice carrying over the empty lot. "Why are you sitting out here all alone?" I looked up, and he was closer now, his friend following a few steps behind. Panic started to rise in my chest, my hands trembling as I tried to think of what to do. There was no one else around, just the bus driver, who was too far away to notice what was happening. The man reached me, leaning over the bench, his eyes locking onto mine. "You know, it's not safe for a pretty girl like you to be alone," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. I stood up quickly, backing away. "Please, just leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Aw, come on, don't be like that," he said, stepping closer. His friend was behind him, watching, a smirk on his face. I felt trapped, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced around, looking for an escape, and then I saw someone, a man, another passenger from the bus. He was standing by the convenience store, watching us. Our eyes met, and I could see the concern on his face. Without thinking, I ran toward him, my feet pounding against the pavement. The two men called after me, their voices angry now, but I didn't stop. I reached the stranger, my breath coming in gasps. "Please help me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, then at the two men, who had stopped a few feet away, their expressions dark. The stranger stepped in front of me, his stance firm. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice steady. For a moment, everything was still. The two men looked at each other, then back at us. I could see the anger in their eyes, the way their hands clenched into fists. But then, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked away, muttering under their breath. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling. The stranger turned to me, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a kind, reassuring smile. "Let's get back on the bus," he said. "I'll make sure they leave you alone." We walked back to the bus together, and I could feel the eyes of the two men on me as we boarded. But they didn't say anything, didn't make a move. The stranger sat down beside me, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The rest of the ride was quiet. I kept my eyes on the window, watching as the city slowly came back into view. The stranger stayed with me until my stop, making sure I got off safely. I thanked him again, my voice still shaky, and he smiled. "Take care of yourself," he said, and then the bus pulled away, leaving me standing there, the world suddenly feeling much bigger, much scarier. I never saw those men again, and I hope I never do. But that day changed something in me. It made me realize how quickly things can go wrong, how vulnerable we can be. I still take the bus sometimes, but I'm always aware now, always watching, always ready. I remember that weekend vividly, even though I'd rather forget. It was the last camping trip my dad ever went on. I was about 13, and my dad had decided to take me along with his friend Eddie on a camping trip near Astoria, Oregon. My dad and Eddie loved the outdoors, and Astoria seemed like the perfect getaway, remote, quiet, and surrounded by miles of untouched forest. It sounded like an adventure, and honestly, I was excited. But if I knew then what I know now, I'd have stayed as far away from that forest as I could. We drove out early on a Friday, the three of us packed into my dad's old pickup truck, along with our tent, fishing gear, and everything we'd need for a couple of nights in the wild. Gremlin, our cat, was with us too. She was an odd little cat, feisty, fearless, and strangely fond of camping. She'd jump into the truck the moment she saw the gear being packed, as if she could tell we were going somewhere new. The drive out to Astoria was beautiful. The dense evergreen forest hugged the road on both sides, and the air felt fresher the farther we got from the town. By the time we reached the camping spot, we were all in high spirits. The place was perfect, a small clearing just a few yards from a calm, babbling creek. Eddie immediately set about getting the tent set up while my dad and I gathered firewood. Gremlin was already sniffing around the edges of the clearing, her tail twitching with curiosity. It wasn't until later, after dinner, that things started to feel off. The sun had set and we were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. My dad and Eddie were talking about their younger days, their voices blending with the crackling of the fire. It was then that I noticed Gremlin wasn't around. Usually she'd be curled up by the fire or stalking something in the shadows, but she was nowhere in sight. "Gremlin?" I called, my voice cutting through the night. No response. "She probably wandered off," Eddie said, shrugging. "Cats do that, you know?" I nodded, but something didn't feel right. Gremlin was adventurous, sure, but she never strayed too far from the camp. My dad must have noticed the worried look on my face because he stood up and grabbed his flashlight. "Let's go find her," he said, ruffling my hair. We set off into the woods, the beam of the flashlight flickering over the trees. The night was dark, the kind of darkness that feels like it's pressing in on you, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. We called out for Gremlin, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response, just silence. And then we heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, almost drowned out by the rustling of the wind through the trees. But they were there, steady, deliberate, and coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. My dad paused, his flashlight beam sweeping across the trees, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. "Probably just an animal," he said, but his voice had an edge to it. He didn't believe it, and neither did I. We kept walking, our footsteps slower now, more cautious. The forest felt different, like it was watching us, waiting. And then we heard the scream. It was the most chilling sound I've ever heard, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between, something that made my blood run cold and my heart skip a beat. My dad and I froze, our eyes wide, our breaths caught in our throats. The scream echoed through the trees, fading into a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the camp, his flashlight beam flickering as he moved. We hurried back, the sound of our footsteps too loud in the silence, the shadows around us seeming to shift and move as we passed. When we got back to the camp, Eddie was standing by the fire, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. My dad nodded, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. "We need to pack up, now." Eddie didn't argue, he just nodded, his hands already moving to gather up the gear. I could feel the fear in the air, the tension, the sense that something was very, very wrong. My dad handed me the flashlight and told me to keep an eye out while they packed up the tent. I stood there, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands, the darkness just beyond the campfire seeming to grow thicker, more oppressive. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall, thin, and pale moving between the trees. "Dad!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "There's something out there." My dad and Eddie both looked up, their eyes following the beam of the flashlight, but whatever I'd seen was gone. The forest was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the wind through the trees. "Get in the truck," my dad said, his voice calm but urgent. "Now." We didn't argue, we grabbed what we could, leaving the rest behind, and ran to the truck. I jumped into the back seat, my heart pounding, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Eddie climbed into the passenger seat, and my dad got behind the wheel, his hands shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and my dad floored it, the tires skidding on the dirt as we sped away from the campsite. I looked out the window, my eyes straining to see anything in the darkness, but there was nothing, just shadows. We drove for what felt like hours, the forest on either side of the road seeming to close in on us, the sense of being watched never fading. My dad didn't say a word, his eyes fixed on the road, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Eddie was silent too, his face pale, his eyes wide. It wasn't until we were miles away, the lights of a small town finally coming into view, that my dad finally spoke. "We're not going back there," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "ever." Eddie just nodded, his eyes staring straight ahead, his face still pale. "We never found Gremlin. We went back the next day, my dad and Eddie at least, to see if they could find her, but there was no sign of her. No sign of the campsite either. Everything we'd left behind was gone, as if it had never been there. My dad never talked about what happened that night. Eddie moved away not long after, and we lost touch. But I know they were both haunted by it, just like I was. The memory of that scream, the feeling of being watched, the flash of something pale and thin moving through the trees, it never left us. Even now, years later, I can't go into the woods without feeling that same sense of dread, that same weight pressing down on me. I still dream about it sometimes, about the footsteps, the scream, the feeling of something watching from the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it. The sound of footsteps, moving slowly through the darkness, getting closer and closer, until I wake up, my heart pounding, my body drenched in sweat. I never did find out what it was that we heard that night, and maybe that's for the best. Some things I think are better left unknown. I've got to tell you this story. I've never really talked about it in detail, mostly because people think I'm making it up. I'm not sure if anyone could truly understand the fear unless they lived it. But you know what? I'm tired of keeping it inside. So here it is. Everything as it happened. It was last fall, during one of those times when I just needed to get away. Life was heavy, work was draining, and I thought that a solo hike would clear my mind. I packed my gear, got in my car, and drove until there was no cell service, nothing but the hum of the wind and the crunch of the gravel beneath my tires. I remember the air being crisp as I started walking, my backpack weighing down my shoulders. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the tall, swaying pines. After a few hours, the trail started to fade, and the forest closed in around me, but I wasn't worried. The map I had showed there was a small clearing ahead, where I could set up camp. What the map didn't show, though, was the cabin. I stumbled upon it almost by accident. It was small, hunched beneath a canopy of tall evergreens, like it was trying to hide. The wood was old, nearly black with age, and a single window, cracked and filthy, stared out like a blind eye. It was weird, sure, but by then the sun had almost disappeared, and the cold was seeping through my jacket. I figured, why not? A roof over my head would beat a flimsy tent any night. The door creaked when I pushed it open, a sound that echoed around the empty forest. The inside was dark, just a little sliver of moonlight filtering in through the grimy window. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam swinging across a table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace. There was dust everywhere, thick enough that I could almost taste it. The air smelled like damp wood and something else, something metallic, like rust or maybe dried blood. I told myself it was just my imagination. I mean, an old cabin in the middle of the woods. Of course it was going to smell weird. I set my bag down by the table and took a deep breath, trying to ignore the way my skin prickled, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. The forest can mess with you like that. I needed to relax, so I got a small fire going in the fireplace, the warmth spreading through the tiny room. It was almost cozy, I remember thinking. Almost. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the flames, listening to the wind outside. It was calm at first, just a low whisper moving through the branches, but it changed. It grew louder, almost like voices, like whispers swirling around the cabin. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was tired, that had to be it. And then there was a knock. It wasn't a hard knock, more like a tap, 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 barely audible over the wind. My heart jumped into my throat, and for a moment I just sat there, frozen. Who could be out here, in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen another soul since I left my car that morning. Slowly I stood up, my legs feeling like they didn't quite belong to me. The door was just a few feet away, and I took careful steps towards it, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I waited, listening. Nothing. I exhaled, almost laughed. Maybe a branch had hit the door. But then, tap, tap, tap. Closer, more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I flicked it on. The beam wobbled as I pointed it at the door. I reached out, my hand hovering over the handle, and paused. Something told me not to open it, that whatever was on the other side wasn't friendly. The hairs on my neck stood on end. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by silence, a deep, heavy silence like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a shuffling sound, like footsteps moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate. The window was too dirty to see out of clearly, just the faintest shadows shifting beyond it. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking anymore. They were circling, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, their steps crunching on the fallen leaves outside. I turned off the flashlight, afraid that the light might draw them in. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt like a kid again, hiding from monsters under the bed. But this wasn't some childhood nightmare. The footsteps stopped right outside the window, and I could hear a faint scratching, like nails on the glass. I wanted to scream, to shout at them to go away, but I couldn't make a sound. I just stood there, my back pressed against the table, staring at that dark window. And then a voice. A whisper, so soft that I almost didn't hear it over the thumping of my own heart. "Let us in." My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just one voice. There were multiple, overlapping, blending together in a chorus of raspy pleas. "Let us in. It's so cold." My skin crawled, every instinct in my body telling me that whatever those voices were, they weren't human. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. It felt like hours, but it could have only been minutes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Let us in! Let us in!" The door rattled, the handle shaking like someone was trying to turn it. I snapped out of it then, my body moving before my mind caught up. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and backed away from the door. I needed to get out. I wasn't about to wait around and see what would happen if they got in. The back of the cabin had a small window, higher up, just big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed onto the table, pushing the window open. The cold night air rushed in, and for a moment I hesitated. I could still hear them at the door, the rattling, the whispers. I didn't look back. I climbed through, dropping down onto the ground outside. The forest was dark, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. I turned on my flashlight, keeping the beam low, moving quickly away from the cabin. I could hear the whispers still, floating through the trees, following me. I didn't run. I was too afraid of tripping, of falling, and not getting back up. But I moved fast, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The path was barely there, just a faint trail between the trees, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me, the whispers growing louder, closer. "Come back. Don't leave." The wind whipped through the branches, and for a moment I thought I saw them, dark figures moving between the trees, slipping in and out of the shadows. I stumbled, nearly fell, my flashlight flickering. I forced myself to keep going, my legs aching, lungs burning. I don't know how far I ran, how long I pushed myself through that dark, endless forest. But eventually, I saw it. The road, the gravel glinting in the moonlight. My car was there, right where I'd left it. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I got the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest was silent again, just the wind rustling the leaves, the whispers gone. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to see if they were still there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. It wasn't until I was miles away, the forest far behind me, that I finally let myself breathe. I pulled over, my head resting on the steering wheel, and I just sat there, trying to convince myself that it was over, that I was safe. But even now, I'm not so sure. Sometimes late at night, I hear it again, a soft tapping, a whisper at the window, and I wonder if I ever really left that cabin, or if a part of me is still there, trapped, listening to them beg to be let in. I need to tell you about the night that changed everything for me and my friends. People talk about traumatic events like they leave scars on your mind, but I swear, what we went through that night carved something so deep that it still haunts me. It was supposed to be just another camping trip, a little adventure before everyone went their separate ways for the next stage of our lives. I never thought that night would leave us tangled in something dark and unforgettable. It started out as any good camping trip does. High spirits, plenty of snacks, and maybe a little too much beer. It was late October and the forest had that crisp, earthy smell. Leaves crunched underfoot and the wind was whispering through the branches, making them sway like skeletal hands reaching towards the gray sky. We were four in total. Me, Chris, Jamie, and Emma. Each of us loaded up with camping gear, excited to find a good spot before the sun disappeared. We found a clearing just off the main trail, the kind of spot where the light could still sneak through the trees. Chris was always the one with the map, while Jamie and Emma took charge of setting up the fire and tents. I remember the laughter, the sound of beer cans cracking open, the warmth of the fire against the cold. It felt safe, comforting even. The sun was setting, and with it, the temperature dropped quickly. The forest got quiet in that strange way it does sometimes, like everything was holding its breath. We were all gathered around the fire, the flames crackling, when we heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the fire's pop and crackle. We all went silent, trying to hear. It came again, soft, broken, like someone was struggling to call out. "Help! Please! Someone help!" We all exchanged glances, a mixture of curiosity and unease flashing in our eyes. Chris, always the brave one, stood up first, aiming his flashlight toward the darkness. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. None of us said anything, but we nodded, our eyes fixed on the direction of the sound. It came again, clearer this time, a girl's voice, pleading. "Please, help me." Emma was the first to react, her compassion kicking in before fear could. She stood up. "We should check it out. What if someone's in trouble?" I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Something about the voice sounded off. There was a kind of echo, like it was bouncing around the trees in a way that made it hard to tell where it was coming from. But we couldn't just sit there. The four of us grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods, the beams slicing through the darkness, illuminating the fog that had started to roll in. It was eerie, the way the mist clung to the ground, shrouding everything in a pale haze. My heart pounded, every rustle of leaves making me jump. We kept walking, deeper into the woods, the voice growing louder. It sounded desperate now, full of panic. "Help me, please! I can't find my brother!" We finally saw her, standing there in the middle of a small clearing, her figure barely visible through the mist. She looked young, maybe in her late teens, her hair wild and her clothes dirty. Her eyes were wide, and they locked onto us with a kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking, "you have to help me. My brother. They took him. They're going to hurt him." Emma rushed forward, her motherly instincts in full swing, and put an arm around the girl. "It's okay," she said softly. "We'll help you. Just tell us what happened." The girl's eyes darted around like she was afraid someone was listening. "He's still in there," she whispered, pointing further into the forest. "There are men. They took him. I got away, but he's still there." Jamie glanced at Chris and me, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. We could all feel it. Something wasn't right. But there was no way we could just walk away. Chris nodded, determination in his eyes. "Lead the way," he said to the girl. She took us deeper into the woods, the darkness growing thicker, the air colder. It felt like we had left the world we knew behind, stepping into some kind of twisted nightmare. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like fingers. The fog was thicker now, muffling the sound of our footsteps, making it feel like we were walking through a dream. I don't know how long we walked, but eventually we came to another clearing. There was a small cabin, its walls covered in moss, the windows dark and lifeless. The girl pointed at it, her hand trembling. "They're in there," she whispered. We paused at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin. It looked abandoned, the door hanging slightly ajar. Chris took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I whispered. "We don't know what's in there." But before we could decide what to do, there was a noise, something between a groan and a wail, coming from inside the cabin. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the kind of sound that told you whatever was in there wasn't human. Or if it wasn't okay. "We can't just leave him," Emma said, her voice shaking. Chris nodded, and without another word, we moved toward the cabin, our footsteps barely making a sound on the damp ground. The girl stayed behind, her eyes wide, her face pale in the moonlight. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the stillness. The inside of the cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and mildew. Our flashlights flickered as we stepped inside, the beams sweeping across the room. It was empty, except for a staircase leading down, a basement. The groan came again, louder this time, echoing up from below. Chris led the way, his jaw set, his flashlight aimed at the stairs. We followed, each step creaking under our weight. The air grew colder as we descended, the darkness swallowing us whole. At the bottom of the stairs we found him, a boy, maybe 12 or 13, tied to a chair, his face bruised, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at us, and for a moment I saw hope flicker in his eyes. Chris rushed forward, pulling out a pocket knife to cut the ropes. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're gonna get you out of here." But as he worked, I heard something, a sound that made my heart drop. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from above. Jamie turned, his flashlight aimed at the stairs. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. We were trapped. The only way out was up those stairs, and whoever was up there was coming down. The boy whimpered, his eyes darting to the darkness behind us. Chris cut the last of the ropes, and the boy stumbled to his feet, his legs barely holding him up. "We have to go," Emma said, her voice trembling. The footsteps were closer now, the sound echoing down the stairs. Chris grabbed the boy's arm, pulling him towards the far corner of the basement, where there was a small window, just big enough for us to crawl through. One by one, we climbed through, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. I was the last one out, pulling myself up just as the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We ran, the boy's small hand clutching Chris's, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the darkness. The girl was waiting for us at the edge of the clearing, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," she whispered. "You have to hurry." We didn't stop. We ran, our breath coming out in ragged gasps, the forest a blur around us. The wind howled through the trees, the branches scratching at our faces, the ground shifting beneath our feet. Behind us I could hear them, footsteps, shouting, getting closer. The boy tripped, and Chris scooped him up, carrying him as we ran. The forest seemed endless, the darkness never ending. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not with the sound of those footsteps getting closer and closer. And then, suddenly, we burst out of the woods, the road just ahead, the headlights of a car shining through the darkness. We made it to the road, waving our arms, shouting. The car skidded to a stop, the driver, a middle-aged man, staring at us with wide eyes. "Please," I gasped. "Help us." He opened the door, and we piled in, the boy sitting on Emma's lap, his face buried in her shoulder. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see figures standing at the edge, watching us. But there was nothing, just darkness, the trees swaying in the wind. The man drove us to the nearest town, a small place, the kind of town that feels almost forgotten, with a single diner, a gas station, and a handful of streetlights. As we pulled in, the boy still clung to Emma, his small frame trembling. The man parked in front of the diner, and the neon open sign flickered above us, casting a dim red glow over the scene. He turned to us, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What happened out there?" he asked, his eyes flicking over to the boy, then back to us. Chris shook his head, his breath still ragged. "It's a long story," he managed, "but there were people out there. They took him. We need to call the police." The man nodded and fumbled for his phone, dialing as we got out of the car. We made our way into the diner. the bell above the door chiming. It was mostly empty, except for an older couple sitting in the corner, sipping coffee, their eyes widening as they saw us. A bunch of exhausted, wild-looking kids, a scared little boy with bruises, and a man clearly rattled. We collapsed into a booth, the boy curling up next to Emma. She stroked his hair, whispering softly, trying to calm him down. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, brought us water without saying anything, her gaze darting between us and the boy. The police arrived soon after, 2 officers in crisp uniforms, their expressions stern. They asked us questions, who we were, what we were doing in the forest, and where we had found the boy. We tried to explain, each of us adding pieces of the story, but it felt so surreal, like we were talking about someone else's nightmare. One of the officers knelt down beside the boy, his voice gentle as he asked for his name. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and frightened. "Danny," he whispered. "My name is Danny." The officer nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "All right, Danny, you're safe now, okay? We're gonna make sure you're okay." Danny nodded, but his eyes flickered back to the window, towards the dark forest beyond, and I could see the fear still etched on his face. I felt it too, that creeping unease, like something was still watching us, something we hadn't truly escaped. The officers took our statements, writing down every detail. When we told them about the girl, the one who had led us there, their expressions changed. One of the officers, a younger guy with a mustache, looked at his partner, then back at us. "You said a girl led you to the cabin?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Chris said, glancing at me. "She said her brother was in trouble. She was the reason we went in." The officer exchanged another look with his partner. "We need you all to come with us," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "There's something you need to see." We were too tired to argue, too confused to resist. They led us out to their patrol car, Danny still clinging to Emma. The older officer drove, while the younger one sat in the back with us, his face pale under the dim interior light. We drove in silence, the road winding back towards the forest, the trees looming like dark sentinels. Eventually, we pulled into a clearing, not the same one we had been in, but nearby. There was another car parked there, its headlights illuminating a group of people standing by a small makeshift memorial, candles, photographs, and flowers. The officers led us closer, and as we approached, my heart sank. There, pinned to one of the trees, was a photo. It was the girl, the same girl who had led us to the cabin. Her eyes were bright, her smile wide, but below her picture were the words, "Missing since October 15th. It was her. But how? How could she have been missing if she had been right there with us?" My mouth went dry, my head spinning. Emma's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide in disbelief. Jamie shook his head, stepping back. "No, this can't be real," he whispered. "We saw her. She was there. She led us to her brother." The officer looked at us, his eyes filled with a kind of sadness. "You're not the first to say that," he said quietly. "Several people have claimed to see her in these woods. She went missing 2 years ago. Her brother Danny disappeared with her." My heart pounded in my ears as I looked at Danny, who was now staring at the photo of his sister, his eyes filling with tears. "Megan," he whispered, his voice cracking. She helped me." The officer nodded. "We've been trying to figure out what's happening in these woods for years. People go missing, and some come back with stories like yours. Stories about a girl who leads them to others in danger." I felt a chill run through me, my entire body going numb. It was like the air around us grew heavier, colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that somewhere, just beyond the tree line, she was still there, watching us, making sure her brother was safe. Chris swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "But who were the people in the cabin? The ones who took Danny?" The officer shook his head. "We don't know," he said. "We found signs of camps, makeshift cabins, but they're always empty by the time we get there. It's like they vanish." A silence fell over us, thick and heavy. The forest around us was dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. I looked at Danny, at the way he clung to Emma, and I realized that we had been part of something much bigger, something far beyond our understanding, something that wouldn't let go of us, even if we tried to forget. The officer finally spoke again, his voice gentle. "You should head back to town. We'll take care of Danny from here. We'll try to find some answers, but I'm not sure if we ever will." We nodded, too tired, too shaken to argue. As we walked back to the patrol car, I glanced back at the woods one last time, my eyes scanning the dark shadows between the trees. And for just a moment, I thought I saw her. A flash of pale skin, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. She was watching, her face unreadable, her eyes locked onto Danny. And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. We drove back to town in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. When we finally got back to our campsite, the fire had long since died out, the clearing empty, the tents cold and damp. We packed up in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It's been months since that night, and I still dream about it. I still hear her voice sometimes, echoing in the back of my mind, a soft, desperate plea for help. And I wonder if she's still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, leading lost souls to safety, trying to make up for whatever happened to her. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that place. Part of me feels like I owe it to her, like I should go back and try to understand. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, knows that some things are better left alone. Because whatever is in that forest, whatever took those people, it's still there. And as long as it's there, none of us are really safe. Not Danny, not Megan, and not any of us who walked away that night. Some nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear her, whispering through the trees, her voice a ghostly echo in the darkness. "Help me, help my brother." And I wonder if she ever found peace, or if she's still out there, searching, forever lost in the forest that took her.